Just bear with me. Loud. So my name is Carrie. I'm an art historian, and I focus on contemporary art. I do not focus on Cuban art. I wish I did. I wish I knew more about it, and thanks to this project, I'm starting to. So I won't be talking about art in Cuba. If that's what drew you here, you can go. I am going to be talking about basically an idea that I want to try out, that I want to play with, and hope that you guys will help me, or at least find it interesting. And it's an idea that came to me when Tanya Bruguera asked me what my talk would be here. And I don't know, I had this idea, it just came in a flash, and I said, curiosity is to contemporary art what taste was to modern art. Modern art, taste is to modern art as curiosity is to contemporary art, which sounded great to me at the time. And I liked it because it's about knowledge, right? And that is really what this whole project is about. So in a way, this is a great example of an artwork that asks us to be curious. The problem is that, of course, the more one thinks about it, the more exceptions and problems one starts to notice over the months between then and now. So I'm definitely presenting that idea in a sort of provisional way, and really as a concept to play with, right? That if we sort of play with that comparison, we might get somewhere interesting. And that in itself is interesting to me because it suggests that there's some kind of epistemic value, that there's some kind of knowledge that we can get that is from things that aren't necessarily a true truth claim, right? So my little analogy between taste and curiosity, modern and contemporary, I'm not making a big truth claim there, but I think there's epistemic value in the play with that idea. So let me just sort of start, and you can tell me if you agree. So first slide. Second slide. Okay. Modern art was not made for viewers as epistemic agents. This is my claim. It was made for viewers who are doing a different kind of work, not epistemic work, not knowledge work, not the work of learning, teaching, and using the faculties of knowledge. And this makes sense because modern art, modernism, comes at the end of this long line back from the Enlightenment, when philosophers were very much talking about the idea of a faculty, an aspect of the mind that was specific for making judgments about what is beautiful, what is good, what is bad, what is indifferent. And this is something that in the 18th century, it was part of the Enlightenment, part of the production of really a new kind of subject. And the way that art was part of that is that art was a place where you could exercise this judgment of good and bad. And I think that more or less, and again, these are like these big claims, that modern art was made for that kind of viewer, for someone exercising taste. And a lot of what we have in our modern museums, in our expectations about what it is we do when we go to look at art, still has that in the background. And what I'm proposing is that that's a problem that for contemporary art, that there's still plenty of art out there that does direct itself to us as the bearers of taste or the exercisers of that faculty, but that on the whole, that's not what contemporary art is for. And that part of the problem that a lot of people have with contemporary art comes from approaching it as that kind of viewer and not being met by what they're looking for. So, as I said, the concept of taste was a kind of new idea in the 18th century too. And it's really interesting because taste itself, and we'll come back to this, always has a problem, that concept of taste. That on the one hand, taste taste can be like having taste, having good taste, right? Having that faculty being very well exercised. And that's, Kant called it pure taste. A lot of philosophers spend a lot of time distinguishing that from that other kind of taste, which is, you know, like I have a taste for chocolate, you have a taste for coffee, right? And that kind, that very subjective kind of taste is, works really well for a society that becomes increasingly consumerist as we move through the modern period. So taste in art always has this kind of push and pull with that problem of taste. And I'm just gonna put a pin in that to come back to, because curiosity, which I'm proposing as a contemporary answer, let's say, to taste, also has some problems. I'm going to give you a distinction that I found in a very early artist talk by the contemporary artist Andrea Fraser, that some of you might know, an American artist who started doing museum-based performances in the very late 80s and early 90s. But this is in something she wrote, a distinction between two ways that that people use, that people make sense of art. And she was talking about all art, like including, you know, Renaissance painting and Baroque sculpture and whatever you could find kind of at the Metropolitan Museum or the Louvre, right? That there's two ways that people relate to it. And for those of you who are familiar with Bourdieu and the idea of distinction, this comes right out of that, that some people have an approach that she calls the domestic approach. And the reason is that it's the approach that would be typical of someone who grew up with good art in their home, good art, quote unquote, with like legitimate kind of culturally valued art in the home. And it is a mode that she says it speaks to sort of who you are and how you feel, right? So if you grow up with it, you don't have to be taught these principles of taste, of the capital T kind of taste. And when people are approaching art in that way, they'll talk more about having the right kind of feeling. So the way I like to think about it is, and I've done this, so every time one complains that other people in the museum are spending all their time reading the text and not looking at the art, you're sort of exhibiting that domestic side that wants you to just have a certain kind of relationship to it that's from the heart right? That isn't about knowledge, it isn't about information. And that other side that maybe is more about information, she called the scholastic approach. And in some ways it's related to what I'm saying about curiosity, but it's also quite different. And she identifies that also with a kind of class-based division, but with class-based in education. So sort of the more degrees you have, especially in art history, the more likely you are to have a scholastic approach, which has to do with knowledge. So not what you feel or who you are, but what you know is what sort of that, from that perspective, that's the correct way to approach art. You need to know, for instance, you need to know some art history. You need to know what comes after what. You need to know, when representation stopped being the quintessence of art making. And it can be just as problematic, would be her point, right? That it's not that one is good and one is bad, that these are actually two competing ways that our art institutions address us. And they're sort of always in tension, which I find really helpful for thinking about museums. And it is helpful for what I'm trying to say, because to be addressed to an epistemic agent, what I'm going to be saying about contemporary art is a little different than that scholastic approach. So it's a third category, really, I'm proposing that maybe is coming into being. Next slide. So what is an epistemic agent? This phrase I'm using, the word epistemology, episteme just means knowledge. And an epistemic agent is somebody who's exercising the ability to know, right? Who's participating in knowing as a process and as an activity. And it's symbolized, right, by different kinds of knowledge professionals. So this is Andrea Fraser being performing as a docent or a museum guide, somebody who's giving a tour, epistemic agent. Fred Wilson doing the same thing, a piece by Pablo Helguera and one by the Yes Men, just to say that a lecturer, a pundit, a panelist, that these are epistemic agents par excellence. Next slide. It's also about sort of the spaces of the laboratory, of archives, schools, right? Those are all places where epistemic agents, where we are occupying that position, where we are being an epistemic agent when we're in those spaces. Scientists, archaeologists, and next slide, please. Even a psychic, right, is a kind of epistemic agent, because it's not a claim about who is, again, who necessarily has the truth, right? It's a claim about what kind of activity you're doing, right? You're involved in knowing as a process, and a psychic is just as much as a scientist. Not saying that those two are the same. No, they're not the same, except they could both be called epistemic agents. And that's kind of helpful for what we're going to be looking at. Could we, let's see, go to slide 6, the next slide. I hope it's the next slide. Yes, okay. So all of those epistemic agents that I just showed you are actually in or by contemporary artists. So from 1989 to about 2010, I think it was the most recent one I showed. And I consider that contemporary art because I'm using that term not to name necessarily the art of this moment whenever the speaker uses it, right? So contemporary can be a slider, and if you're using it in 1950, then contemporary art is what's happening in 1950, yeah, right? So I'm not using it that way. For me, it actually is starting to look like it has some kind of content, the way it came to be used after around 1989, which is a nice year to use because the world really changed, right? And the conditions for art became very different. And I think it's a mode, a kind of condition for art that is more distinct from the modern than anything before that. So some people will put the 60s and 70s and 80s into contemporary. For me, it's still involved with the modern. Okay, so contemporary art for me is this later period, and two things I want to talk about with that are what are those conditions? That's going to come up in a minute, and also, is that over? It's also something to be thinking about. Does that have an end? And is this all might be related to that. Next slide. So the art of Walid Ra'ad, sorry, it's tiny. Walid Ra'ad is a great example of art that is addressed to the viewer as an epistemic agent, a being who knows or is involved in knowing. And some of you may know his work that he presented as the Atlas Group. He came into prominence in 2002 in Documenta, where he had a piece that was that got a lot of attention. I'll give you a little bit of a sense. I can't go into too much depth, but he's the artist, he's the guy in the hat here, and he's doing a performance, and the performance is explaining his work to the viewers. So the viewers here are positioned as learners, right? Very literally. And he is, the speaker, the performer, the lecturer. He is an epistemic agent, but so are they. Learners are also epistemic agents. Next slide. This is also not going to work if you're in the back. But this is the piece he was showing them. And I want to tell you about it very briefly. I'm not going to be able to do justice to it. But what he was explaining in that picture is how this actually has white letters, white writing in Arabic all along it. And you can just see it here where that red splotch is, the white writing underneath. But it's white writing all along. And he tells them that that this is the wall from where he was working. Oh, thank you. That's great. That this is the wall from where he put down all the names, the art history, the names that came to him telepathically of Lebanese artists from the 20th century. And he's just telling them that as he lectures. These are the names that came to me telepathically. And I wrote them down, and then I showed them to people to be checked. And someone got very irritated at him and said, you post-war Lebanese artists, meaning after the 90s really, you don't know anything about your past. You don't even know how to spell the artist's names. And the person took out red spray paint and covered up one of the names or marked one of the names in red. And as the story goes, Ra'ad is telling them he felt really bad, so he went out and started researching all of the people with the misspelled names, and that's the kind of collages of information and kind of archival work that you see him doing in this piece. But then it stopped because he said he realized that the source of the telepathic information wasn't the artists of the past, but artists of the future who were communicating to him these names, not in order to get any information about, to give him any information about these artists, but in order to generate that splotch of the color red. He says that because future artists, for some reason, don't have access to red. Maybe they can physically have the pigment red, they can't use it. It doesn't work for them. And he leaves that, and that's it. He leaves it very mysterious, very open-ended. So if we could, let's try the next slide. Or actually, could you go to the previous slide? Before that, yes. If you can see way over on your right side as you look at it, you see those marks on the wall, those little gray strips? That's the wall text. Okay, so instead of, artist, date, materials, it's that whole story I just told you in much more detail. That's all on the wall there. So if he's not performing it, that's how it works. It's in the wall text. So in that sense, it's like that scholastic idea of being attracted to the information, needing to know, taken to a ridiculous level, right? On the other hand, it's not scholastic at all, because it points to it with the idea of art history, right? The idea of these names of artists that you should know from the past, and this missing art historical knowledge, right? That is what it's kind of about. But then he tells you that he's getting that information telepathically, and he just says it like it's just a fact, which means that if you're seeing the performance or reading it, you're suddenly not just taking in information, right? You're evaluating it, and actually you're kind of confused. If we could go back one to the performance image of this piece, when you're experiencing it with him in person, telling it to you, it's not just an epistemic problem like, do I believe in telepathy and is this guy sane? It's how do I act? Do I just sort of nod and say, okay, right? Or, do I walk away? Do I scrunch up my forehead, right? There's this moment of just what is happening, right? And that moment is also a knowledge moment, but that's the moment where you get curious. Okay, so in that way, the piece is generating curiosity, as it is with the whole idea of the red splotch and the future artists and leaving it blank at the end. What is the catastrophe that's going to cause us not to have access to red? Yes?
Is he faking it, or is he believing
that he had it? Yes, Pete? I think if he were here, sorry, Waleed, I'm going to speak for you. I think he would say something like, that, yes, he received it telepathically. But I don't think he's a believer. Okay, so again, we're in a space where truth claims really matter, but the content is not necessarily what matters about them, right? Whether it turns out to be true or not. And that, to me, is an attitude that we see in a lot of art of this period. Let's see. Could we go forward a little more? Or, and again, next. Okay, so this slide is here with names of some art historians and some rubrics, right? Some terms that art historians and critics have used over the past decade or more to name the same kind of phenomenon that I'm talking about. This sort of turn toward questions of knowledge and knowing in contemporary art. Artist as ethnographer, archival turn, artist as historian. I'm not going to go into all of them, but just wanted to point you to the work of the people who've done all of that writing, and to say that I think it's very much in keeping with what I'm saying. But it tends to have to do with, you see, the artist as historian, right? The artist acting as historian. And what I'm kind of pushing us towards is, what are we doing as viewers? Right? Who's the spectator as historian, right? Or something, some kind of epistemic agent. Okay. I think, could we go to the next slide? We can go to the next slide. Okay. So I think the fact that there are all these different movements, right, or tendencies that have to do with knowledge is one way of saying, yes, okay, contemporary art has something to do with that. There's other ways, though, and one of them is kind of art historical and has to do with coming after the condition of conceptual art. So once everything about what is an artwork and who is an audience member and what is a museum has been put into question, then everything has to be made, a decision has to be made about everything, right? You can still make a painting, you can still make a beautiful abstract painting, but you have to decide to make a painting, right? That's not a given that that's what you would do. There are no, not having givens, I think, is a very important aspect of art really since the 70s, let's say. But in particular, what I'm thinking about is what happened after that, in that moment, to the idea of the work itself, right? And this you hear all the time. Ever go to a student's critique, right? Where critics or come around to talk to an artist about, a student artist about what they've made, and the student will start saying, well, it comes out of this experience that I had, and I was thinking about this and that and that. And the critic will say, but where is that in the work itself, right? That's what you sort of want, is for all of that to sort of be in the work. And it also has to do with that wall text question, right? Like, it shouldn't, that idea that the object is all we're supposed to be looking at and thinking about, and we shouldn't need to have supplemental information, right? And that art that does require that is faulty, right? They haven't done enough to internalize what matters in the work itself. Well, I don't think there is a work itself, and that's one of the things that came out of this conceptual art tradition, that there's always external information. It's just whether you have it or not, right? Whether you already know it, and so you can say that, that this, let's say that this urinal is an artwork by Marcel Duchamp. If you have that information, then there it is. It's not in the object itself, right? So I'm playing around with words here, but for thinking about a kind of art making that really turns on that, not being the work itself. So that the work, the object, is gonna always need a supplement, and the supplement is part of what the artist makes. Next slide. So this is a work by Cameron Rowland, an American artist who has, I think, become very important in the last few years. And in this work, you walk into the gallery and you see this very normal piece of office furniture. And it's actually quite monumental in the space all by itself. It's new, it's crisp. There are things to look at here. In an art context, you can even say, okay, it's kind of like a minimalist sculpture, or am I looking at design questions? Next slide. This wall text has to be there, or this text, and you're not going to be able to read it. That's okay. You can go back. What it tells you is that desk is called the Attica series. Attica is one of the most famous and infamous prisons in New York State, and it was produced by prison laborers. In order to get this desk, the artist space, which is the gallery, had to contract with the government to get a certain code that they could use to order from the system. So they became implicated in that system too. So we're implicated, the gallery is implicated, and as soon as and there's more to get from that text, as soon as you've read that, this has a totally new feeling to it. The meaning has totally changed. The feeling it gives you has totally changed in a very real way, but it's not in the work itself. Or maybe it is, but we don't have access to it, right? It's process of how it was made, by whom. Next slide. Next slide. Another artist who does this in an interesting, very, very different way is an American artist named Dario Robleto, who he does lots of different things, but he's made these very ornate looking, almost Victorian looking objects. But what he does is intervene at the level of what his materials are and how he describes them. and then how the museum has to describe them. So, feathers made from stretched audio tape of the last recordings of now extinct birds and now extinct languages. Glass inkwell, homemade ink made of lampblack ground fulgurites, glass produced by lightning strikes when heat from the blast melts surrounding sand, cuttlefish sepia, homemade paper, volcanic ash from Mount St. Helens, ink-dyed willow, brass, and typeset. Okay, so that's just the list of materials, right? Even if the museum doesn't want to give you explanatory text, they have to give you that because those are the materials. And of course, they're deeply poetic and evocative, and we know that we're looking at something about extinction and climate and geological change. And we also, of course, have an epistemic agents problem as we learn that. I can't see that that ink is made with fulgurites. I'm not even sure that's what fulgurites really are. He's telling me, right? And so, in fact, he's very insistent that he absolutely does this. He uses these materials. He can sort of, sometimes he'll imagine a material and not be able to find it, but that's kind of a whole amazing part of his work is how he finds lead salvaged from the sea and mammoth bones and all of these things that he says are in his works. Here, really, what I want to point to is this idea of speaking of distractions, there's a really cute scene back there. So might even be a performance, I'm not sure. So an example of this supplemental composition, an artwork where it's not supposed to be the object itself. The work itself doesn't really exist or doesn't exist in itself, but that is the work. And the work is still evocative, poetic, emotional, right? It still works on all those levels, but it requires this other information. Let's see. So, that's right. The information creates that. I don't know if poetic. I use that word too, but yeah, that right. So that they're made one. Yeah, the sort of aesthetic quality and the information are the same. Thank you. That's super helpful. So those are works that really make that supplemental relationship between the object and information very clear. But I want to say that it's part of the condition of contemporary art that a lot of work is that way. It just doesn't make a big point of it, right? You need information. Like how many, if you've been to this exhibition is kind of special and different, but in general, if you go to pretty much any contemporary art show, you're going to see something where there's a little tidbit of information somewhere that the artist grew up near Chernobyl, or that this particular forest was raised in 1989, or you can think of any number of these little details that something, I don't remember the work, but it mattered so much that the soldiers that I saw marching in a video were Greek. But I would never have known. These are contemporary soldiers marching. I would never have known. And when you know, the whole thing makes sense, right? And that happens all the time. And we're not always given the information, which drives me crazy. And it's why you walk around exhibitions like this with your guidebook, right? Or you see everybody crouched around one little piece of paper that has in 10-point font all the information written in a very scholastic kind of paragraph, right? For people who are in a very educated mode, let's say. And maybe somewhere in there you find your little data point that makes the whole work open up, right? And this has gotten especially bad since a while ago now when I turned 40. and started needing reading glasses to see this thing that you can barely get your head around somebody else's shoulders in order to see. It's like they want to keep you from having the information that would help. And in a way, they do, right? Not any one particular person. That's just a leftover, a kind of built-in aspect from that earlier modernist idea that the work itself is supposed to have all the information, and also that you're not supposed to, that it's not supposed to be about knowledge and information. It's supposed to be about feeling and visuality, right? And taste. Taste, not knowledge. But we have this weird condition now where it's almost like the apparatus there's not a new apparatus, but there's a new kind of art, is what I was saying. So that it's not, I don't think it's a bad thing that you need to carry around your guidebook or peer over people's shoulders, although I think there could be technical solutions that would be better for our eyes and backs. But it's worth it, right? It's worth it to get that information. And that's another way that that this is a distinctly contemporary art issue, is that if the sort of model for modern art was the white cube gallery, right? Because it's all about just seeing the work. The model for contemporary art, the place you expect to see it, the place that it's kind of made for, in the way I'm saying, that's my opinion, is an exhibition like this. It's an international, multi-artist, temporary exhibition, right? That you have to see at a certain time, so everyone has to go, that you come from many places to go see, and where you see art that's made by different artists from different countries, right? The fact that it's international is really important. And that's because there's a whole way of explaining why that's the case now that has to do with the neoliberal global economy and the role that these exhibitions have in relation to it. And I think that's true. But it's also true that they are a kind of amazing site to encounter places and ideas and people that are not in the world you come from, right? That to have exchanges, just to be in contact, not in the same way as when you read the newspaper, right? But in some different way, to be in contact with this fact about the Greek army, or this forest, or whatever it is, that we go in part for that that's part of what's happening, and it's of great value, right? It's also serving the needs of the neoliberal global economy, but it's also having this kind of productive, helpful function, and that's part of why we go. So if that's the kind of condition, then that is why inherently we're going to need information, right? Because we're not all coming from one tradition. We're not all coming from Europe, right? And we're not going to be all schooled in the same art history. And we're not going to have all the same references. And not having all the same references is sort of the point, right? To value that, to want to do that, and to actually do that work, you have to be curious, right? And that's part of what I mean by this idea that the work is addressing you as an epistemic agent, as somebody with curiosity, and that being someone with taste is great. It's just not what this is really about. Next slide. Okay, so two final notes about curiosity. First of all, curiosity is a passion, and this is from David Hume, one of those 18th century philosophers, and he just lists somewhere the three passions are pleasure, pain, and curiosity, which is really weird when you think about it. Curiosity, this sort of epistemic need and desire, he's putting with pain and pleasure as these almost biological drives. And I like remembering that because, again, the work that appeals to curiosity is not necessarily appealing to us in a totally cognitive manner. It is not the art of information, even though information is part of it. It's about that drive to know. That's what I think a lot of art that we see today is kind of counting on, and that you won't enjoy, like you won't get it if you don't approach it as curious. Next slide. Curiosity can also be a problem, okay? So there's good curiosity and bad curiosity. Something that does happen in these contexts of the post-colonial globalist condition of exhibition is that there can be a kind of exoticism about seeing people and things from all these different parts of the world that naps onto the history of colonialism, depending on who and you are and where you're from. And their exoticism is a kind of possessive curiosity, right? It is a curiosity. It's wanting to know, but it's wanting to have an effect on you, and it's not reflexive. So good curiosity would be interested in not just this object or artist from a different place, but what is my relationship to it? That is one way of thinking about what constitutes a kind of good or bad curiosity, just like there could be good or bad taste. And those are my judgment calls, right, about what would be good or bad, but I think that one is important to point to. The other sort of risk is curiosity in the realm of contemporary art can very easily be trying to be in the know. Again, to have the knowledge, right? To be up to date, to be caught up, to know the latest and most important. And that is using curiosity as a mode of distinction, just like taste has been used and that scholarly mode has been used to sort of position ourselves in various class structures. And it's what we do, but it's also something to be resisted, I think. And that it's when going to see contemporary art feels more like trying to keep up and keep in the know, then I think it's not accessing our that deeper curiosity that I think is part of what contemporary art is for. Okay, that's what I have, except, what time is it? My watch stopped. Okay, questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, other animals too. Maybe it's a mammal thing. I'm not sure where the line is, but yeah, exactly. It's a life thing. Right? Whoa, 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 whoa. Wait, what? Say it again. In Okay, let me just say it. So in German there's no word for curiosity. What? That's blowing my mind. That's amazing. Yeah. So Yeah. Right. That is so interesting. I can't wait to learn more about this. But I can tell you about the word in in English and I think all the Romance languages. Is that right? French and Portuguese and everything. That first of all, so cool. Curiosity. The root is the same as curator, and it's care based. It's about being careful or taking care. Like curate is a priest, right? So curators take care of collections is the older use, and it's the curiosity. The original, the sort of earlier meanings or usages were about being very careful, meticulous. It meant something almost like meticulous. Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing all of your really fascinating ideas, in particularly around reflexivity, which relates to this idea of care and
Yes.
curiosity,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
If
yes,
you tie
yes.
them all together, reflexivity is around questioning of one's own assumptions in a very careful way,
That's right.
in a way that shows care to recognize that we may not understand.
That's
what's going
exactly what
on.
I was trying. Yeah. Yes. I agree.
and to ask. So anyway, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about reflexivity and how people can develop a practice of reflexivity.
Okay. So I don't know if everyone could hear, but the idea was that kind of reflexivity, that curiosity about my relationship to it, and as well as about it as an object, um, that is related to the idea of care and like being careful with your curiosity when you're engaging with it in order for it to be this kind of tool that I'm talking about. I like that. I think that's right. It's interesting, right? Because, okay, reflexivity, first of all, the like examining your assumptions and all of that, that's a pretty good Enlightenment principle, right? And in fact, art that looks at itself is part of what modernism is. So, curiosity, these things are not they're not really opposed, they're just different. Um, Curiosity, I also recently learned, I'm really excited about it, was only used when it meant being inquisitive. It was only used in a negative manner up until the 18th century, right? Because before that, it's bad to be curious. Curious means you're asking about things that only God should know, right? That this is not meant for you. This is not human. But in the Enlightenment, it makes sense, right? That the desire to learn becomes positively valued, or at least neutral. That's the way it is. And again, I'm speaking about English, but I think the Romance languages are parallel on that.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned so much. Given what you had said about pedagogical or didactic materials and how they get employed, I would love to get your take on how they manifest in this year's documenta, because I personally have noticed a relative lack of texts on the walls. A lot of works don't even have titles because maybe they're not meant to be positioned as artworks per se.
Yeah.
I don't know because I don't have anything to tell me what to think. So see how that works.
You need your guidebook.
Yeah, and especially given that there have been controversies relating to how these works are to be interpreted, you would think that having this type of information available would be helpful.
Help.
So what do you think?
Yeah. I haven't seen everything yet. I just got here 2 days ago. But I have noticed that what I've noticed is my big heavy guidebook isn't as helpful as it usually is, right? Which means that the things have been arranged differently, and I'm just trying to kind of flow with it right now and understand it. I am not ready to have any kind of critique about that. Remember I said, if you were here at the beginning, that this model I have of what is contemporary art, there's a question about when it ends, right? If you've noticed, all of my examples of art that is really addressed to us epistemically are from before like 2015. And I think there's lots of examples since then. I think it's all still true, but I kind of wonder if, and this is just speculating, if by rupturing the idea of the singular artist as the reference point for everything that we experience in an art setting, if that has also broken us from all of these kind of tensions between object and wall and information and vision. And I'm going to be thinking about that a lot.
Yeah. I also wonder if it has to do with historically excluded communities of creativity.
Yes.
And how they're rejecting, well, yeah, in many ways they may be pushing back against the structures of knowledge that have historically oppressed them, for lack of.
I think, yes. Whereas you could say that all the times where there have been artists from all over the world involved in exhibitions, it has been speaking to that model, right? It has been participating in the discourse, the international art language, in a way that maybe this exhibition is breaking from. I'm curious about it. We'll see. Other thoughts? I can show you if you want to go. But if we could go forward on the slides. Another one and another one. Yeah, thanks, perfect. Can curiosity be cultivated, right? So that's always a question in discussions of taste. You know, do you just have it? Do some people just have taste and other people not? Or can taste be educated? And at least in the US, one of the prominent ways that museums justified themselves in the 20th century was to educate taste, that would kind of raise up the impoverished, right? Because they would be getting access to this legitimate culture and they would be gaining taste and therefore becoming that kind of model of the subject, right? In a deeply patronizing way, but it was meant as the public service of the museum to educate taste. Okay, so what would it mean to educate curiosity? I don't know. But what I have here is something that I've been using in my teaching a class on this Introduction to Contemporary Art, where I wanted the students to be curious and to not start from judgment, which is where they always want to start, right? I like it, I don't like it. I get it, I don't get it. It's for me, it's not for me. And together with the problem of expectations being geared toward that other more modernist model of what art is for, this causes a lot of problems. I just think there's great, it's a resource. Contemporary art is this like resource for thinking about stuff that matters now, period, right? That is the value. And a lot of people are not getting access to it because they're starting from some other place. And so my idea is, okay, I just made them be curious. So throughout the semester, they had assignments that had them look at a work of art in the area and use each of these 4 kind of areas, I call them tools, to generate questions. So, and I found it really helpful because it's sort of like in a lot of art history classes, the first thing you do is formal analysis to kind of learn how to look in a formal visual way. But that doesn't work for contemporary art all the time. A lot of it, at least, it doesn't. But turns out this does work. So artistic choices gets at a lot of those form issues, but phrases it just in a different way so that they're asking, why a mural, right? Why why have a mural there if it's about an archive? Well, I guess it's not just about an archive, right? Any kind of question about why is it like this and not like that, I think gives them, you can have the kind of access that like painters get looking at paintings and figuring out how it was made and what came, right? It's that kind of, a little bit of that kind of access for work that isn't, that is put together differently, I guess. And then the next one they do is mode of spectatorship. So that's where I want them to think about stuff like what I was talking about today. Does it address you as a TV watcher? Some video art, right? It would be totally right. Does it address you as a YouTube watcher? Does it address you as a citizen of taste, right? And what is and then you have to ask sort of what is causing that? What are the artistic choices doing to create that mode of spectatorship? And how do you feel about it? Because we don't always fit with it. But if you ask what is that mode, then you can walk into a museum and know why it is you feel weird. Like you just give yourself a minute to think about why you're not connecting with this. Oh, it's looking for this kind of spectatorship that that's not me. And that tells you so much. And then we talk about site. So what are all the questions you can come up with about where it is in literal space? You know, where has the curator placed it? If it's an object, if it's in public space, what's going on with the site? What matters about where it is? Does it matter that it's in a museum? A lot of art, it really does, right? Like it would not be the same if it was in a library. Well, what would it be saying about that? But then it can also be like geographical site, historical, social sites. Well, it matters that it's in the American South because of the history of slavery and it's addressing this or that, and it would be really different if it were in Boston. That is the kind of thing. And then last would be historicity, and that's where the questions from art history and other kinds of historical context come into play, where they're asking, could this have been made at some other time than it was? And why or why not? And sometimes it could, right? And that's okay. But a lot of times it couldn't, right? And I sort of encourage them to think about things, because we're looking all at contemporary art. Is it before 9/11 or after can be a helpful tool for some art, right? Not, obviously, not everything, but depending on what the subject matter is, and that can be helpful. And I think that the pandemic will be another of those points that will be useful for before and afters, and for thinking about what you can do kind of with just the bare bones information that you have on these little cards. What can you do to be curious? Yeah? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can. How would I take, okay, the challenge is on. Okay, James Turrell, well, why does he have you sitting down? I'm thinking of the Sky Room in New York. Sorry, I'm being so American-centric. But so why are we sitting down, not standing up? I'm usually standing up when I look at the sky. Okay, he wants us sitting for a particular reason. What? It's more comfortable? Yeah. That means we're supposed to be here for a while, right? And then you're going to see the sky change color. So it would be that kind of thing. And then it's also, then you could get to the historicity and think about the artist's biography, because he's Quaker and it's like the Quaker meeting house. So you can, from these little questions, you can get everywhere you kind of want to go. And even if you're in a museum and you don't have access to information, there's a lot that can happen, I think, just from thinking about it, talking about it. And that's where I'm starting these days with them. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or we can just hang out, or yes. Yes. Right. The question about the intention of, what about the intention of the artist and where does that fit in? So perfect And correct, yes. One of the things I'm doing in this talk and just in the way that I'm thinking about art really gets away a bit from questions of intention. And that's good and bad. I always try to tell these students in the intro class to go take an art making class to hear how artists talk about art. But I'm interested in the kind of historical meaning that comes from the viewer's act of reception. Like it's just a different place of locating the points of significance, right? And but I do go to artistic choices because that is where it starts, right? I mean, I'm not saying anything goes. Whatever we think is important at all. But if you can keep grounding your questions in why would someone do that, you might know details about that artist that let you answer that question very literally, or you might have to speculate. And informed speculation is a kind of knowledge, I think. Yeah. Great. Happy to sit around and talk, but I think we should officially wrap up. Thank you.